The fire reached the Beartooth Plateau in late July 1981 and did not stop. It burned through 3 weeks of dry weather and left almost nothing standing. The slope above Cook City, Montana lost every tree it had carried for decades. A Forest Service crew photographed the aftermath from the highway in early September. In those photographs, charred trunks lined the hillside like rows of burnt posts in pale ash. The soil between them was the color of old concrete and almost as hard underfoot. Seeds buried in that forest floor for decades were gone within the first few hours. The seed bank, the buried record of everything that could grow there, was largely destroyed. Nothing nearby could restock it. The nearest healthy tree stands were kilometers away. Botanists surveyed the burn in the spring of 1982 and filed their count. 17 species of lichen across 4,000 acres of bare gray mineral soil. One of those botanists sent photographs to a researcher in Denver named Diana Tombach. She had been studying a specific bird and what it did with pine seeds for 6 years. What she said to that botanist was, "This is exactly the kind of hillside they will find." The Clark's Nutcracker belongs to the crow family, not the woodpecker family. William Clark first described the species near the Salmon River in Idaho in 1805. He guessed it was a woodpecker because of the bill. He was wrong. The bird is gray-bodied and roughly the size of a small crow with black-edged wings. What separates it from every other North American bird is a pouch beneath its tongue. That sublingual pouch holds up to 95 pine seeds at one time, without the bird swallowing. No other bird in North America carries this anatomy for bulk seed transport. The Nutcracker harvests seeds from pine cones in late summer and early autumn each year. It pries open cones that have not yet split and extracts seeds before wind can carry them. Then it fills the pouch and flies, sometimes 20 kilometers from the tree, to a cache site. It buries seeds in clusters of 3 to 14 per hole, pressing each one just below the surface. It covers each hole with soil and a thin layer of debris to hide it from competitors. Then it flies back to the tree, refills the pouch, and starts again. One bird repeats this circuit hundreds of times across a single autumn. Studies in the Sierra Nevada and Northern Rockies estimated one bird can cache 98,000 seeds per season. Most go into the ground roughly 2 centimeters below the soil surface. 2 centimeters is the depth most effective for whitebark pine germination in mineral soil. The birds retrieve between 60 and 70% of what they bury, based on field retrieval studies. The remaining 30 to 40% stay in the ground through winter, into spring and beyond. Those forgotten seeds are not failures, they are the seeds that become trees. In winter, with a meter of snow covering every surface landmark, a nutcracker still finds its caches. It navigates to specific burial sites using the positions of boulders, ridge lines, and standing trees. Those forgotten seeds are the seeds that become trees. The bird plants by forgetting. Whitebark pine grows between 1,800 and 3,600 meters across western North America. It holds ground where almost nothing else will establish: rocky ridges, exposed slopes, thin soils at tree line. A mature individual survives temperatures of minus 40 degrees Celsius on open high-elevation terrain. One documented tree in the Sierra Nevada was 1,267 years old when blister rust finally killed it. The seeds of the whitebark pine have no wings, no fluff, and no dispersal mechanism of any kind. A seed dropping from a whitebark pine cone travels less than 2 meters from the parent tree. Without the Clark's Nutcracker, the whitebark pine cannot colonize new ground. There is no other path. Remove the bird from the equation, and the tree stops moving within a generation. Every whitebark pine grove on a high ridge today began as a nutcracker's forgotten cache. The multi-stemmed clusters common in mature whitebark stands, 3 or 5 trunks sharing one root base, came from one hole. One bird, one cache, one autumn, and 3 trees grow sharing the same underground start. Tombach first watched a Clark's Nutcracker cache whitebark pine seeds near Tioga Pass in 1973. The bird landed on a burned stump and began pressing its bill into bare soil. It opened a small hole, released seeds from its sublingual pouch, and covered the hole. Then it flew back toward the tree line and returned to the same stump 40 seconds later. She followed it on foot for most of that afternoon, marking every cache site with a small flag. By the time she lost the bird, she had marked 47 individual cache sites on the slope. She returned to those 47 sites the following spring to check for germination. Seeds had sprouted at 22 of them. One bird's one afternoon had started 22 seedling clusters. Her doctoral work, completed in 1978, described the relationship in ecological terms for the first time. She argued the whitebark pine had evolved its seeds specifically for transport by this one bird. The seed's size, its caloric content, its complete absence of any self-dispersal mechanism, all pointed one direction. Other ecologists challenged it. A tree depending entirely on one species for reproduction seemed too fragile to persist. Tomback kept building the record through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. She tracked nutcracker foraging across Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and the Sierra Nevada over multiple years. Every burned hillside within 20 kilometers of a mature whitebark stand received visits from the birds. Every open south-facing slope with exposed mineral soil received fresh caches each autumn. The bird was not choosing randomly. It selected for specific terrain characteristics every time. Tomback's 1982 paper argued the open parkland structure of whitebark pine at treeline was not natural accident. It was shaped by bird behavior. The clusters of trees on every ridge were nutcracker caches from past seasons. Back on the burned Beartooth slope, the first winter after the fire came in November and covered everything. The remaining ash blew east in the first hard winds and thinned across the open ground. By April 1982, snow had pulled back from the south-facing portions of the lower slope. What it left behind was pale gray mineral soil, exposed and uneven and free of debris. A colleague of Tomback's named Robert Achuff returned to the burn site in June of that year. He had no expectation of finding anything. The soil survey from the prior fall had come back bare. He walked the lower quarter of the slope slowly with a clipboard and a hand lens. In a southeast-facing section of exposed mineral soil, he stopped and crouched down. 4 seedlings, whitebark pine, each just over a centimeter in height, leaning into the slope. He kept walking. By the end of that morning, he had found 11 more seedling clusters, 15 whitebark pine clusters on a hillside with no whitebark pine source trees within walking distance. The nearest mature whitebark stand was 3.4 kilometers to the northeast, on a higher ridge upwind. The seeds had not blown to this slope. Whitebark pine seeds do not blow anywhere. He called Tomback from a payphone in Cook City that afternoon and described what he had found. She told him to survey the full slope, record every seedling location, and note each cluster size. He spent 2 more full days on the burned hillside and came to a total of 139 seedling clusters. Not one seedling grew alone. Every single one was part of a cluster of 3 or more. Groups of 3, 5, 8, sometimes 11 seedlings within a handspan of each other from a shared root zone. Each cluster was one nutcracker cache from the prior autumn or the autumn before that. Achuff returned every June for the next 4 years to count and photograph the permanent plot. By 1985, the seedling count on his monitored section had reached 412 established plants. Frost killed many first-year seedlings each spring. Pocket gophers took others through the summer, but Clark's nutcrackers arrived each autumn and deposited new caches through October and November without fail. A motion-triggered camera set up in October 1984 recorded 34 separate caching visits in a single morning. Footage from 6 weeks of that camera showed 11 different individual birds working the same hillside. None were coordinating. All were selecting the same south-facing mineral soil zone independently. Quick pause before the forest really starts to take shape. If you want to go deeper than a video allows, the seed physiology, the coevolution timeline, the mutualisms most nature documentaries skip entirely, I put it all into a digital ebook, A Bird Scattered Seeds Over a Dead Hillside, What Grew Over 40 Years Stunned Ecologists. It covers this exact story and several others like it, in more detail than I can fit here. It's available now as an instant digital download, and picking it up directly supports videos like this one. The link is in the description below. Alright, back to the Beartooth Plateau. By the summer of 1991, the slope above Cook City was visibly changed from the highway below. A CHIF's monitoring zone now covered a 2-hectare permanent study area with aerial photo records. Aerial photographs from that July counted 2,200 established white-bark pine trees across the full burn. The trees averaged 40 centimeters in height, and many grew in multi-stem Nutcracker cache clusters. A researcher named Susan Kearns joined the monitoring team in 1990 to track what else was establishing. Her first full species survey in 1991 found 8 flowering plant species sheltering inside the young tree clusters. Those same species were absent in the open ash field between the cluster zones. The trees were creating small pockets of reduced wind and increased soil moisture around their bases. Those marginal differences were enough for plant species that could not germinate in open mineral soil. Clark's nutcrackers were still arriving each autumn. 10 years of caching had not slowed. By 1991, 3 of the oldest trees on the plot were producing cones for the first time. Nutcrackers were harvesting those cones and caching seeds into still open ground further down the slope. The forest was now expanding its own footprint through the same mechanism that had built it. The trees that grew from nutcracker caches were not only trees, they were structure in the hillside's food web. Red squirrels arrived on the monitored plot by 1988 and began harvesting cones from the young trees. Squirrels hoard pine cones in large ground-level middens and do not spread seeds the way nutcrackers do. But the squirrel population stayed low enough through the 1990s that nutcrackers retained access to the upper terrain. A bird survey conducted by a University of Montana team in 2001 found 14 breeding species on the slope. Before the 1981 fire, historical records showed 2 breeding species using that section of hillside. Among the 14 were 3 woodpecker species that required standing dead trees for nesting and foraging. The burned snags from 1981 were still standing 20 years later and still serving a biological function. Northern goshawks were nesting in the largest white-bark pines on the upper slope by 2001. Clark's grouse were using the dense lower clusters as thermal cover through the winter months. Each species that arrived shifted the conditions for the ones that came after it. Kearns wrote in her 2001 field notes, "What we have is a food web building itself faster than any succession model predicted." Satellite imagery from the summer of 2001 showed canopy cover at 34% of the burned area. In 1982, that number had been 0 across 4,000 acres of bare gray mineral soil. The canopy was uneven and clustered, with open gaps of bare ground between each grove. That pattern reflected exactly how nutcrackers cache, in groups at chosen sites, not in even distributions. The forest the bird built looked nothing like a planted forest and everything like a wild one. Tomback flew over the site that summer and looked out the window of the survey plane. One bird species had seeded 4,000 acres of alpine slope over 2 decades without a contract or a deadline. The seeding was a consequence of winter food storage. The forest was a consequence of forgetting. By 2011, the white pine blister rust had arrived on the Beartooth slope in measurable numbers. Cronartium ribicola is a fungal pathogen introduced to North America from Europe around 1910. It took roughly a century to penetrate fully into the high-elevation whitebark country of the northern Rockies. The fungus enters through the needles and works downward through branch tissue toward the trunk. Once it reaches the cambium layer, it girdles the tree and cuts off nutrient flow between roots and canopy. A girdled tree cannot move water upward. It dies from the top down over several years. Kearns recorded the first infected tree on her permanent plot in September of 2009. By 2011, she had confirmed infection in 18% of the trees on the monitored zone. The oldest trees were hit first. The trees established from the earliest 1982 caches showed the worst damage. These were also the trees that had been producing cones and feeding nutcrackers for 15 years. Mountain pine beetles arrived on the slope in 2013 and added a second source of mortality. Beetles bore beneath the bark in numbers large enough to overwhelm a tree's resin defenses within days. Combined with blister rust, beetles were removing established trees faster than new seedlings could compensate. Kearns calculated in 2014 that the plot's tree count had fallen 11% from its measured peak. For the first time since 1982, the number dying exceeded the number newly establishing. Tomback walked the upper slope alone that summer. She had been working on this for over 40 years, she said later. Standing in a forest that took 30 years to grow and watching it go backward is not a research problem. It is something harder than that. In the summer of 2021, a research team of 5 returned to the Beartooth monitoring site. They brought GPS units, drone equipment, soil core samplers, and 3 seasons of satellite comparison data. Tomback was 74 years old and joined the team for the first 2 days of fieldwork. The team expected widespread blister rust collapse across most of the upper grove. The drone imagery from the first morning revised that expectation before lunch. The upper slope had not collapsed. Its composition had changed. A subset of whitebark pines in the original stand carried a heritable trait that slowed or stopped fungal infection. The nutcrackers did not know which trees were resistant. They cached seeds from all trees in the stand. But resistant trees survived while susceptible ones died, and resistant trees kept producing cones. The nutcrackers kept caching those cones alongside the rest through every subsequent autumn. Over 3 decades of mortality selection, the trees surviving on the slope skewed heavily toward resistance. The 2021 field team sampled 300 trees from the monitoring zone using tissue analysis. Roughly 40% showed elevated resistance markers by the methods they applied. Across the wider northern Rocky Mountain whitebark pine population, that figure runs around 8%. The burned hillside had become, by selection and accident and one bird's foraging behavior, a concentration of resistant trees. The disturbance, the disease, and the bird had together produced an outcome no restoration program had targeted. No manager designed this. No grant proposal budgeted for it. It happened because one bird species had been caching seeds on one hillside for 40 years. Tomback sat at the upper edge of the surviving grove on that first afternoon and looked downhill. In 1981, she had seen ash and charred trunks in photographs sent from this hillside. In 2021, she was sitting inside a 40-year-old subalpine forest that no human hand had planted. Canopy cover on the monitoring zone had reached 61% in the healthy sections. Plant species richness in the understory counted 34 species across the monitoring plot. In 1982, that same ground had held 17 species of lichen and no vascular plants. Camera traps on the upper slope had photographed grizzly bears twice during the prior summer season. Whitebark pine seeds are one of the highest calorie pre-hibernation foods available to grizzlies in the Rockies. The bears were following the food. The food was following 40 years of a bird's autumn caching. Clark's nutcrackers were still arriving each October and working the gaps left by rust-killed trees. A new generation of birds was caching on the same hillside their predecessors had worked since 1981. The team published their findings in the journal Ecology in early 2022. The paper's core conclusion was precise. Without the Clark's nutcracker, the burned slope would not carry whitebark pine today. Wind-dispersed species would have colonized the lower sections. Engelmann spruce might have reached mid-slope eventually. But whitebark pine has no mechanism to reach a burned hillside without this bird. There is no other path. Every whitebark pine on that slope came from a nutcracker cache buried a centimeter or 2 below the surface. Every cluster of stems sharing a root zone traced back to one bird's cache on one autumn afternoon. The lead author had counted over 4,000 individual whitebark pines across the 40-hectare monitoring zone. Each came from a cache. Each cache was a decision made by a gray bird thinking about winter. Kearns put it this way in the paper's discussion section. She wrote, "We describe this as recovery because we arrived at year 40 and found trees where there had been none. But the bird did not arrive at year 0 to recover anything. It arrived to eat." What we call recovery was, from the bird's side of the interaction, winter food storage with an imperfect memory. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service listed whitebark pine as a threatened species in December 2022. The species range has contracted by more than 50% since 1900 across the western United States and Canada. Climate change is warming high elevation zones and pushing viable habitat upslope faster than the tree can track on its own. The window of livable altitude is narrowing from below as temperatures rise. Above that window, bare rock runs out the slope. Clark's nutcrackers track the pine. Where the pine retreats upslope, the bird follows. Where the pine cannot relocate fast enough, the bird cannot compensate for the absence of seed sources. Researchers in Montana, Idaho, and British Columbia are collecting seeds from blister rust-resistant whitebark pines at documented sites. They grow resistant seedlings in nurseries and plant them at high elevations where nutcrackers already forage. The goal is to place resistant seed sources in terrain the birds will find and harvest and cache. The plan does not try to replace the bird, it uses the bird as the dispersal mechanism, because nothing else works at this scale. Earlier programs had tried planting whitebark pine by hand at high elevation burn sites. Survival rates were low. Hand-planted seedlings went into the wrong soil texture, the wrong aspect, the wrong depth. The nutcracker selects the right slope orientation, the right soil condition, and the right depth, every time. That selection has been refined across millions of years of bird and tree evolving alongside each other. The nutcracker seeded zones from 1982 had reached 61% canopy cover on the same hillside by 2021. Hand-planted experimental zones from the same era on adjacent slopes are still sparse. The bird is a better planter than any program that has tried to work around it. In August 2022, a fire moved through the eastern portion of the Beartooth recovery area. It burned roughly 200 hectares of the forest that nutcrackers had seeded since 1982. Some of the trees that burned were the ones that had first produced cones in the early 1990s. The fire moved through in 4 days and left behind the same gray mineral soil the 1981 fire had made. Clark's nutcrackers were observed caching seeds in the new burn area within 60 days of the fire going out. Kearns was not on site. A field assistant captured it on video in October. She wrote about the footage in her notes without surprise. The birds are already there. They always get there first. Drone surveys of the new burn zone began in October 2022 with full baseline documentation. By the following spring, 34 seedling clusters had been confirmed in the first monitoring transects. Not one cluster had been planted by any program. Every one traced back to nutcracker caches from the prior autumn. The bird had started seeding the new ground before the ash surface had fully dried. It did not register what had been lost on that slope. It registered terrain that matched what it needed: open mineral soil, south-facing aspect, access to surviving seed trees on the adjacent ridge. The same conditions that started the 1982 seeding cycle started the 2022 cycle on a new section of hillside. The research team now has baseline data from year 1 on a new burn in the same landscape. They know what to look for because they watched the previous cycle run for 4 decades. What those 40 years will produce depends on the same things it has always depended on: the bird, the seed, the cold ground, and enough time. There is a language problem in how conservation programs describe what they accomplish. The language runs toward project management, planting targets, seedling survival rates, carbon offset projections. Those frames fit programs that put trees in the ground the way a construction project pours foundations. The Beartooth Hillside was covered by no program. No program touched it for 40 years. A bird was hungry in the autumn of 1981, and in every autumn that came after it. It buried food it would need in winter and forgot a portion of what it buried each year. The forgotten food germinated in spring. The germinated seeds became trees. The trees became a forest. The forest attracted squirrels and goshawks and grizzly bears following a food chain that followed a bird. 40 years later, ecologists walked into that grove and called what they found stunning. What was stunning was not that a forest had grown on a burned hillside over 4 decades. A burned hillside will eventually carry some kind of vegetation if left alone long enough. What was stunning was the specific forest it produced, and the resilience concentrated inside it. By 2021, the population of whitebark pine on that hillside carried 5 times the rust resistance of the regional average. No conservation program had designed that outcome. A bird forgot where it put its food. The field team photographed the grove from the drone before any of them set foot inside it. On screen in the tent, the image looked like a forest that had always been in that place. 40 years before, that slope had held 17 species of lichen on bare gray mineral soil. One bird changed the starting conditions in 1981 by doing what it does every autumn in every year it lives. What happened after that took 40 years to become fully readable. The hillside did not know it was dead. The bird did not know it was planting a forest. The forest did not know it was supposed to be impossible. It grew because the conditions were there. The bird had moved on to the next cold slope with the right soil before anyone came to look. It was already working on the next 40 years.